So, a question that we are very regularly asked is, why did you write this book? And we think about this actually starting in some ways in the same place that that prom picture started. So, back in high school, both Nate and I were told, achieve your potential, be your best self, go, conquer your dreams. And we internalized that and pursued our own paths, did different professional pursuits. And then when we got married, there was this collision course where all of a sudden there was a completely contradictory message. Join your lives, be one, be in love. And all of a sudden there was this big conflict. Do I do what I want and what's best for me, or do I do what's best for us? And in that conflict, we found there was really no guidance, that there were great books for couples around emotional regulation and some about how to communicate, but no one had really looked at this modern time and said, how do you create a mindset and how do you create a structure so that you can be equals and in love? And as we searched for it, we thought, gosh, if it's not out there, we want it to be.
Yeah. So the next step then became, okay, we're going to write a book on marriage, which turned out to be a kind of daunting task because as soon as we started telling people we're thinking about writing this book on marriage, our friends, coworkers, random people we didn't even know would come out of the woodwork and say, "You better be careful. I knew a couple once, they started a podcast on how to have a better marriage and they got divorced." And so we were warned by many people that we were touching essentially the third rail of self-development by doing this project. And that kind of scared us, but it didn't deter us from the project.
Mm.
What it did do is it changed the way we thought about writing a book. We wanted to make sure this wasn't a book about Kaley and Nate's marriage, and how to do marriage like us, because we are totally imperfect. We get in all sorts of arguments and fights all the time.
Not
We're
about all the
well, not all the
time.
time, but we're like any other couple that we've
Yes.
experienced some really profound struggles in our
Yes.
marriage. So early on, we decided we wanted to interview about 100 people to just understand what is the condition of modern marriage. How are people dealing with this struggle, as Kaley said, to be equals and in love, which we think is kind of like the fundamental struggle of modern marriage. And so we did all these interviews. And one of the things that was most interesting to me is that we asked people, if you were reading a book on marriage in the modern age, what would you want to learn? And almost everybody, not everybody, but I would say like 80% of the people we interviewed said some version of, I would just want to know that I'm not the only one who's struggling to figure this out. That me and my husband or me and my wife, we're not alone out there trying to figure this out, that there are other people who are also experiencing these challenges and this struggle. So I thought that was a really interesting
Yeah.
sort of first insight that we got.
Yeah. And what that really also gifted us were the struggles that couples were facing so that we could look for the tools that would be most valuable to couples in this modern context. So, as a for instance, we heard in tons of our interviews some version of, we are so busy. We just, gosh, we are stretched at the seams. We don't have very much time. And so that really let us know that we needed to create an exercise for couples to get clear on what they needed to say no to so that they could say yes to each other. Another example is that couples would say to us, like, hey, we find that we're arguing all the time about whose turn it is to do housework or who cares more around the house. And so we knew that we needed to address both the mindset component of that, how do you get out of the scorekeeping mentality, and also create some exercises so that people could design roles that made sense and start to decrease or eliminate that fight. And then the last one that I thought was really interesting is couples said to us a lot, they're like, hey, so we're living kind of in parallel space. We care about each other, but we are so exhausted that when we get to date night, we're talking about our Costco list or we're planning logistics. And so we knew that we also needed to help couples remember to ask good questions because the quality of the relationship that was showing up in the everyday interactions that showed up in the walk or on the stroll or sitting on the couch watching TV was reflected in the bedroom.
Yeah. So all that's to say, these interviews were incredibly valuable for us.
Yeah.
And in many ways, they were the inspiration for this book where we said, all right, there are these common challenges that everybody's facing. A lot of the existing marriage books don't talk about these challenges. Let's write a guidebook with practical tools, exercises, so that not only do you have some insights about how to do this, but you actually have some real tools and ways to build these habits into your everyday life.
Absolutely.
So that was kind of the vision. And now we're going to go into the meat of the content because you're probably thinking to yourself, okay, great,
What
you
is
wrote this toolkit for
80/80?
modern marriage, but 80/80, what is that? Like, that's like the main question we get whenever we talk about the book. So before we get to that question, we want to start with 50/50, which is another ratio, and this is really, we think of this as the starting point for the exploration into modern marriage because 50/50 is kind of the mindset and the ethos that most modern couples have going into marriage. Because we're told, as Kaylee said, you're supposed to do great things, you're supposed to achieve your potential. And we're also told, thanks to 70 years or so of cultural transformations, that in a heterosexual marriage, for example, we're both equals. So the solution to this problem then of how do you stay in love as equals becomes this idea of 50/50 fairness. And we interviewed all sorts of couples and we found that this was, there are all sorts of ways that this showed up. But one of the things that was really interesting is we would ask people directly often, how does fairness show up for you in your marriage? And a lot of times people would say, like, oh, fairness, like, we never really fight about that. It's not something we have to deal with. But then we'd say, well, what do you fight about? And underneath the conflicts they described, there was almost always some struggle for fairness, a fight over what is or isn't fair, some form of subtle scorekeeping that was going on in the background.
So, as we describe some of the faces of fairness that we heard in our interviews, if you have access to chat, we would love to hear if any of these resonate with you or if you have your own versions of how fairness might show up in your relationship. So, as a for instance, one of the versions that we heard is what we called the domestic scorekeeping fight. And this was all about, I canceled a meeting to be here for the cable guy. The least you can do is pick up at ballet. Or some version of, when I make dinner, I leave you maybe one or two dishes. It's totally unfair that when you make dinner, the entire kitchen is a disaster.
So, another way this shows up, and again, just becoming aware of the manifestations of fairness can be a total game changer. So, number two is the friends and family, or friends and extended family fight. And this one was just amazing to watch as we interviewed people. So there's one couple, they were talking about how they evenly and fairly divided Mother's Day and Father's Day between their two families. And their solution was, well, we'll do Mother's Day with my parents, Father's Day with your parents. The problem was it wasn't fair because then it came to the question of, like, when are we going to leave for your parents' house and when are we going to leave for my parents' house? And this one couple in particular told us they had a huge fight over, like, the exact down to the minute time that they left for each of these gatherings. So this shows up a lot for many different couples.
It's been really interesting that the version of this that we've heard in COVID has been, how can we do so many Zoom cocktails with your friends? Isn't it my friend's turn?
Exactly. Even in COVID.
Even in COVID, who would have thought? So the third fight that we heard over and over was the money fight. So this was who was saving versus who was spending, and whether or not someone's purchase was fair or justified. So, flavors of, I can't believe that you just bought a new computer. It's not your turn for a new computer. And the person being like, no, 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 I need this computer. This is for work.
And then there's actually 6 in the book, so you'll learn 2 more in addition to these. But the final one we want to leave you with is the free time fight. This probably resonates a lot if you have a kid or if you've ever had a kid, because the moment you bring that child home, all of a sudden, free time becomes like domestic gold, right? It's just incredibly valuable because it's incredibly scarce. And so there was one couple we talked to, they were telling us about a big fight they got in because the woman had gone to Target to buy stuff for the family. And the husband said some version of, well, you had your free time, so I'm going to go for a run now. She was like, I went to Target. That wasn't free time. That was me buying a bunch of crap for the family. So, anyway, that's just another way this shows up. And again, it can be really useful just to start to see how this shows up for you and to become aware. That's kind of the first step, is to
Mhm.
bring awareness to it.
Yep. And so, why doesn't fairness work? Like, why are we even having this conversation saying, well, gosh, doesn't that seem like a good thing? And the first issue with fairness is that to make it perfectly even actually requires you to keep score. I've started thinking about this almost like a tug of war where each person is pulling for his or her side of what they want. And to have that rope land perfectly in the middle is almost impossible. And in order to do that, you each have to be pulling in your own direction. So, in some ways, it's facilitating conflict or comparison or resentment when it's not perfectly fair.
So that's one problem. The other problem, which was fascinating, is we started to explore the literature in family studies and psychology, is that when it comes to our perceptions of fairness, we're effectively deluded. Like we're looking through the lens of all these cognitive biases that make it almost impossible to make these assessments. And there's two main reasons for this. One is a problem that cognitive psychologists call availability bias, which is basically just a fancy way of saying all of the information about my wonderful contributions to our life, that's all available to me. I have firsthand experience with like the dishes I unloaded and the school drop-offs I did. But when it comes to Kaylee's contributions, I mean, it's not really available, right? I see some of it.
Right. And so, same thing, right? I know every basket of laundry folded. I know every birthday card remembered. But what's happening over there, very fuzzy. And we often compare in the same amount of time. Hey, the hour that I just spent taking care of the house was an hour that you were watching TV. That's totally unfair. So, you can see how it all starts to fall apart.
So that's only one side of the problem, though, because there's this other cognitive bias that comes into play, which is what we think of as overestimation.
Mm.
So again, there's all these studies in psychology showing that when it comes to domestic labor, so childcare and house care, we are incredibly bad at estimating how much we've done. Right. So we're actually pretty good at estimating when it comes to work in the office. I spent 3 hours working on that proposal. But when it comes to childcare or dishes, things like that, we're really bad at estimating. We tend to overestimate. So if I say I did dishes for 90 minutes, it was probably more like 60 minutes. And the net of all this, which I think is really interesting, is that when I say I'm doing more than my fair share, I'm doing 60% or 70%, that number is effectively based on total fantasy and delusion, right? So that's part of the reason why these fairness fights never go away, because we're using really bad data that just doesn't line up and doesn't make sense.
So we're clear 50-50 doesn't work, but what might work instead? And that's where we really landed on 80-80. Now, 80-80 in many respects is just a play on numbers. If you're aiming to get to exactly 80, you're still in the same mindset of scorekeeping. The big idea with 80-80 is to completely drop keeping score, to try to do more than your fair share. In part because in that effort, a couple things shift. The first is we recognize that we're deluded in how we were keeping track anyway. And so we stop. We aim for something so that maybe we land closer to somewhere in the center. The other reason, though, is that in the effort to do more, in my effort to do 80%, it changes the way I feel. That instead of striving for fairness, I strive for radical generosity. And that same act, whether it's vacuuming the floor, doing a pickup, making a call, spending time with someone's family, it feels like a gift. Instead of feeling like a tally that I'm keeping, it feels like a gift to me. It feels like a gift to my partner. It feels like a gift to us. And what's really cool about 80-80 is that there are two parts that are able to really transform. The first is your mindset. That when you're in 80-80, your mindset can change to that of radical generosity. So instead of scorekeeping, you're trying to overshoot. But that's just the first part. What that makes possible is a new structure. So, this is where you can organize your values, your priorities, your boundaries, your roles, and balance power in such a way that it feels like you win together. Instead of that tug of war in 80-80, you come together, you kind of drop the rope, you come together and say, how do we win as a team? And as we talked about before, that gets reflected in intimacy. So these two pillars, the mindset and the structure, really come together in 80-80 to be a new guide for modern couples on how we can do marriage in a way that feels like we're equals and in love.
And one thing I wanted to just say here is it's been really interesting. We actually wrote a newsletter that's coming out tomorrow about this. That as we've launched this book, it's now been out for about a month and a half, 2 months. We've started to see kind of the lines of criticism coming from various critiques of the book. So, for example, we had a critique by the reviewer of the New York Times where she said, like, I love this idea, radical generosity. Who wouldn't sign up for that? But how could this possibly work in the real world, right? Like, the conditions of marriage are so messed up and our minds are so crazed that there's just no way this can work. And so I just wanted to say, like, you may be having those thoughts, and we've had those thoughts at various times. But one of the things that was really cool, both about like living the practice of this book, but also doing these interviews, is we found that there are actually all sorts of practical habits and strategies you can use to operationalize what sounds like a really, far-reaching concept, this idea of radical generosity, that it is totally possible. And when we talk to the couples who are really thriving, they all articulated some version of radical generosity or contribution or going beyond 50-50.
And so, what are some practical things that you can do in the realm of mindset? Well, there are three, and we will show them here. So, in order to shift your mindset to that of 80-80, the first piece is to shift how you think about contribution, which is what you do. And so, right now, you can write yourself a little note, you can put it in the chat if you are so inspired, is to think about what is one thing that you can do that would be a gift to your partner and or to your relationship. Now, these can be small things. These can be things like, instead of putting your shoes in a hiding place so that you can't find them because I tripped on them, which may or may not have happened in our marriage, instead, can I put them by the door in a place that you'll easily see them? Or when I'm the first one in the kitchen, can I just turn on the coffee so that you can have a fresh cup when you come down? Or writing a sticky note that you put on your partner's monitor. I was lucky enough, I got one recently. So you could think about what's one thing that you can do that would be a contribution to your relationship, to your partner, that would feel like a gift. And the call and response is really that of appreciation. What's one thing that you can appreciate about your partner each day? And I think about these as being on a scavenger hunt. So at our house, we had an Easter egg hunt. And it turns out that when you're on those scavenger hunts, you find what you're looking for. So if I'm looking for all the ways that my partner is not living up to expectations or falling short, I find them. But if I go on a scavenger hunt looking for the ways that they are awesome and I tell them thank you for it, it's amazing how things change.
And then the final piece of this 80-80 mindset is a practice we call revealing. And I think this is really important. So, we do a lot of content and tips on Instagram. And one of the things that we often hear from people on Instagram is, again, this some version of, I'm trying to be radically generous and my partner isn't reciprocating. And I don't know what to do. And I'm frustrated. And one of the things we often tell folks like that is, well, contribution is really important. Appreciation is really powerful, but there are some moments where there are just these inevitable misunderstandings, hurt feelings, frustration, disagreements. And if you can reveal those truths from a spirit of kindness, that becomes a really essential part of the process. And it turns those moments of disconnection and discord into opportunities for connection, which is actually kind of amazing. So yeah, there's a whole practice around that in the book, but that's the basic idea of revealing.
Absolutely. And so, with that mindset as our foundation, then we can build the structure. And structure, in some ways, can sound abstract. What we're really talking about is just the systems of your life that allow you to live in such a way that you feel more aligned and like a team. And this really starts with knowing your shared values. And we do a whole exercise in the book that's around getting clear about what are the 3 or 5 values that help you and your partner know what this chapter of your life is about. And there are lots of different values. You could choose adventure. There's a couple that sold their belongings and live in a van and are traveling the world. You could choose service, that there are couples who feel like they can now give back and serve mostly on boards or do philanthropy. Or you might say, this is an era or a chapter for us about creating security. And we're going to give a lot of energy to our jobs and our careers. All answers can be good answers when you're aligned with your partner. So if you start with those values, from those come. And so, what roles do we want to play? Who is going to do what so that we can align for that? And then what priorities are we going to live? What are we going to say yes to in our life? And then the reciprocal, because yeses don't mean very much unless there's a no. What are the boundaries that we're going to set so that we can actually be connected to our priorities? With power, we really think about who's in control and how can you use structure to balance power in your relationship. And then finally, as part of structure, is intimacy. How can you make sure that there is space for you to be truly connected?